This presentation explores the topic of strategic alliances. If we think about supply chains and their structure, not all of the parts of a supply chain is actually owned by a single company. And so, because you have a number of independent owners owning various components in the supply chain, more often than not, these individuals have to come together in collaborative relationships. So they actually need to form strategic alliances to allow the entire supply chain to function efficiently. What's driving that is the fact that the business environments are changing, and they're changing in the sense that if we think about concepts such as global supply, where suppliers are just simply all over the globe. You're searching for competitive advantage by either finding low-cost suppliers, responsive suppliers, and so on. And so these are different parts of the supply chain owned by different people. And because of the growing complexity brought about by the whole global structure of supply chains, then partnerships become extremely important. Sometimes the resources that are needed for managing the supply chain, particular skills and so forth, or when we're talking about the actual logistics aspects such as fleet of vehicles and so on, or when we're talking about ocean liners, etc., those things are becoming increasingly scarce. Sometimes there are a number of functions that are not performed very well by a company, and it may actually need to outsource some of these activities. And it's just by the nature of the supply chain, some activities are just performed by other people, okay? Because if logistics is not your core competency, you're a manufacturer, you go and actually need to outsource part of your distribution function or your transportation function to a third-party logistics provider. So these things happen just by the very nature of the supply chain. When we think about the activities that take place in the supply chain, we could categorize them into four groups. Internal activities, which are the activities that the firm typically would keep for itself as part of its core competencies. So those are performed internally. Sometimes a firm would actually do some acquisitions. So maybe you might actually take control over a third-party logistics provider and own that part of the supply chain. Or you might actually take ownership of a distributor. So sometimes purchasing other components within the supply chain actually happens. So acquisitions require that the relationships need to be managed very effectively. In some cases, the transactions are just simply arm's length in the sense that you have a supplier providing a service, but there's no real intimate relationship between the supplier and the buyer in this case. And then you have what we call strategic alliances. This is now where the two parties are coming together for strategic advantage. In other words, each of them need to create value out of the relationship. And so those relationships tend to be long-term in nature. And there are some risks and there are some rewards. And the rewards have to be shared and the risks have to be shared as well between the two parties. So when one is considering whether or not to go for a strategic alliance, there are a number of questions that you could ask. Is the relationship going to actually add value to the products and services that you're providing? Will it help to gain access to new markets? Will it strengthen the operations of the firm? Will it add technological strength? Will it also provide some strategic opportunities for growth? Are there some organizational skills that are lacking that can be acquired through that partnership? And so, for example, third-party or contract manufacturing, if you think about a strategic alliance between a designer and a manufacturer in a case like that, well, one has to say that the manufacturing skills are not currently available in the buyer, so the buyer basically acquires that sort of a skill. And then, of course, is it possible to also build financial strength from the relationship. So in these strategic partnerships, while they offer advantages, it's possible for some disadvantages to exist. And typically what happens is that you have to be careful that in the relationship, particularly if it is an outsourcing relationship, that core competencies are not outsourced or they're not compromised. In the sense that from the relationship now, your partner is gaining a certain amount of information about how your company operates. And so if it is a non-trustworthy partner, then there's a risk of your core competencies being copied by that potential partner, who could then forward integrate or backward integrate, whichever the case may be, and then try to become a competitor. So care has to be exercised in a case like that. So what are some types of strategic alliances that we would consider in the supply chain management context? One is third-party logistics. Another is what we call the retailer-supplier partnerships. And then distributor integration, where the distributor is integrated into the operations of the buyer. So what is third-party logistics? 3PL. And essentially, we see the common elements that we see in strategic partnerships, that it's long-term. There's usually some kind of multiple functions that are provided by the supplier. There has to be some kind of integration between the two parties in terms of their processes. So for example, if you're manufacturing and a third-party logistics provider is taking your products from your docking bays to a distribution center, then clearly the processes have to be integrated. That is, the manufacturing processes and the distribution or shipping or transportation processes. Those have to dovetail pretty well. And usually you have two types of third-party logistics providers. Those that actually own the assets, and so they exist for a long time, or some of them that are non-asset owning, that might actually just be formed because of the opportunity that exists. All right? In terms of the advantages that third-party logistics providers bring, well, they have core capabilities in logistics, and they bring that to the buyer or the firm that is actually purchasing that service. All right. Sometimes they bring some technological flexibility in the sense that they may be using some sophisticated software for scheduling distribution, for planning and scheduling of distribution. So that capability is now brought to the buyer. Okay, and so the ability for the firm now to be able to meet the needs of its customers is enhanced because that third-party logistics provider has some capabilities that take advantage of technology. In some cases, certain third-party logistics providers may have some geographical reach. Maybe they have subsidiaries in other locations, in other geographical locations, so they could assist the buyer in expanding their reach by taking product from the buyer and then bringing it out to their subsidiaries, who will then further distribute in their respective regions. There could be flexibility in the service offerings and flexibility in the resource and workforce size. So one of the things that you benefit from a third-party logistics provider, the headache of dealing with employees or downsizing or right-sizing or increasing capacity is really not an issue that the buyer has to worry about anymore. And so in terms of adjusting workforce size and so forth, that is handled by the third-party logistics provider. Right? Main issue with dealing with any strategic partner has already been mentioned, which has to do with the potential loss of control inherent in an outsourcing relationship. And then it's possible that the vendor may actually copy some of the core competencies of the buyer in a case like that. So it's very important that the buyer only outsource non-strategic activities. So that way they minimize the risk of being copied and then finding themselves going head to head against what was once a service provider who has now become a competitor. There are some issues that need to be given some consideration when entering into a relationship involving third-party logistics providers. For one, it's important to know what is it going to cost you, because if you were doing it if the buyer were to do it on their own, they have to have a sense of what their own costs are, so that they could determine to what extent that the third-party logistics provider is providing some cost advantage. Otherwise, it may make no sense unless you're competing on, say, a different performance criteria, not on cost, but say, for example, response, and that third-party logistics provider can be a lot more responsive than your own organization. Another issue involving third-party logistics providers is the idea that the customer orientation of that provider is very important, because the person that's actually purchasing the services may have special requirements, and then the question is, can that third-party logistics provider adapt its service model to meet the requirements of the buyer? So that has to be considered in making a decision whether or not to go with a particular third-party logistics provider. There are two issues that has to do with whether or not the provider actually owns the assets or don't own the assets. Typically, those that actually own the assets have invested quite a bit of money. They have a fair amount of infrastructure, and have to worry about human resources, their customer base, economies of scope and scale, the systems that they have managing the organization that they've built. And in some cases, they may very well have policies and procedures that make them very bureaucratic in the decision-making process. Well, what does that mean? It means that they are less likely to be willing to negotiate because they have systems that are entrenched. They have a culture that is entrenched, and that they may not necessarily be responsive. So if you're purchasing the service from them, you have to purchase it on their terms. However, non-asset owning companies, they may have limited resources, and then of course, as a result, may have less bargaining power. They may be more willing to be flexible, and they might be more willing to meet the customer's requirements. Because they don't own the assets, they could sort of mix and match the assets that they require to provide the service on an as-need basis. So it sort of appears to give them some degree of flexibility in being able to meet the requirements of the buyer in this case. All right, so just some things to keep in mind as one attempts to establish this relationship with a third-party provider, a third-party logistics provider. So one of the first things is the importance of the confidentiality of data. Because data is being shared between the two parties, confidentiality is important. This relationship is in essence an outsourcing relationship, and so therefore there has to be some performance measures and indicators that would allow the buyer to know whether or not the relationship is working. So that's very important. What kind of criteria that is going to be used if subcontractors might actually be used as part of the arrangement. So in other words, you enter into an agreement with a third-party logistics provider, but that provider may be using subcontractors. And it must be very clear, because the subcontractors may not handle the products of the buyer in the same way. So in other words, there has to be a clause that extends to the provider and their subcontractors. Escape clauses should be negotiated into the contract so that if people are not happy, they can get out of the relationship. And of course, ways to ensure that goals are actually met, or to know that goals are actually being met, should be discussed and agreed upon between the two parties. All right? Another kind of relationship we talked about, because we talked about three types, is called supplier retailer relationships or retailer supplier relationships. And this involves a sort of cooperative relationship between the supplier and the retailer. The supplier has a lot of knowledge about manufacturing, what's being manufactured, manufacturing lead time, production mix, scheduling, and all those things. But the retailer has demand knowledge. And so if they could bring those two sets of knowledge together, they certainly can benefit each other. All right? So there are a couple of different strategies that fall under retailer-supplier arrangements. One is called a quick response strategy. And so in essence, the supplier will have a window into the retailer's inventory levels. And so they would receive point of sales data from the retailers, and that information is then used to synchronize production inventory activities so that the supplier can respond very quickly to the requirements of the retailer, particularly if that retailer is going to use things like promotions as well. All that data that helps to shape the demand should be shared with the supplier, and then the supplier uses that information to optimize the scheduling of products to that retailer. Okay? There is a slightly different version of this called continuous replenishment. Continuous replenishment, and you see that in grocery stores where maybe on a weekly basis milk is being delivered, certain types, cans of soup or whatever, Campbell products. So we see there is a sort of a fixed time frame or fixed interval over which you have items of replenishment. So in a sense, the inventory model being used is a sort of periodic review model where the amount that is actually shipped to the customer may vary, but the period over which the review is actually conducted is actually fixed. All right? And so suppliers receive the point of sales data, and they use that data to prepare shipments based on the current inventory levels of the retailer. All right? And so over time, as they really get the relationship very tightly together, they might better be able to reduce some of the inventory levels so that they can minimize the costs associated with inventory. Vendor managed systems are becoming more and more popular, and essentially what you have is that the supplier will take ownership of the inventory in the retailer's store, and would be monitoring the sales, and at some point a replenishment is triggered, so that is agreed to, but the ownership of the inventory can very well be either the retailer or the supplier, but the control, the decisions around how much to stock is actually left with the supplier. The goal of many vendor-managed inventory programs is to eliminate retailer oversight over specific orders. And a number of companies use it. Companies like Walmart, Procter & Gamble, name it, Home Depot, they all use vendor-managed systems. In terms of requirements to make the retailer-supplier partnerships work, there has to be information that is readily available, and that information has to be shared. Top management has to be committed, and there has to be trust between the two parties, because we have the sharing of information. If there's no trust, then the collaborative relationship really cannot work very well. So it's important that at the beginning that there has to be some contractual agreement that covers a number of elements, such as who owns the inventory, what are the credit terms in terms of when money is actually paid, who is actually going to place the orders, right? What performance measures are going to be used to assess the extent to which the relationship is actually working, and so forth, right? And there's some additional steps needed where they ought to be, the information system has to be integrated between the two parties because they have to share it. They have to be able to develop effective forecasts, so they must agree upon a technique for actual forecasting, and then some sort of a decision support system that would allow them to do coordination of the inventory levels and the transportation policies that will take control over what kind of inventory is maintained at the retailer. All right. There are some advantages to retailer-supplier partnerships, of course, because the supplier has pretty good knowledge about the manufacturing schedules, lead times, inventory levels, and so on. And they could do things to try to avoid the bullwhip effect. On the retailer side, they have demand knowledge, and they could bring those together. So there are some other benefits that happen as a result of the fact that in putting the relationship together, there may very well be a need to redesign or re-engineer the retailer-supplier relationship. So they may try to eliminate redundant order entries, automate the manual tasks as much as possible so that the information can be transmitted very quickly. They could reassign tasks between each other so that they have greater levels of efficiency, and then eliminate unnecessary steps of control that perhaps was necessary in a non-partnership environment. Okay. Like anything else, there's always disadvantages. The need for the technology could create an issue. The fact that there may be, not fact, but possibility of a lack of trust may also be an issue. The supplier has to take a fair amount of responsibility for managing the inventory, right? So that could actually increase the expenses for the supplier, because the supplier may actually need to take on more employees because of that increase in the managerial role. And then consignment arrangements may actually increase inventory costs for the supplier and so forth. So these are just some of the potential disadvantages. In the literature, there are some examples of successes and failures. There's one success, Western Publishing Golden Books. They use vendor managed inventory in a particular children's line of books at several of the retailers. You have a point of sales data that is actually used to trigger reorders, and so this is not done manually anymore, and the inventory is delivered to a distribution center, or in some cases directly to the store. Ownership of the books shift to the retailer once it actually is, the deliveries arrive at that particular store. In the case of Toys R Us, the company has even managed the entire book section for the retailer, including inventory from suppliers other than Western Publishing. So, talk about a pretty good relationship here, all right? But there have been failures. So there's a company called Spartan Stores, a grocery chain. It shut down its VMI effort about 1 year after initiation. And it had to do with the fact that there was a lack of trust between the two parties. One problem was that the buyers was not spending any less time on reorders. So in other words, the buyers were supposed to relinquish that control and let the suppliers take care of that, but they did not trust them. They did not trust the suppliers enough to be able to stop carefully monitoring the inventory levels. So I guess they must have chosen the wrong partner in a case like that. So they tended to intervene instead of letting the supplier make the decisions around inventory. And then the other thing too is that the suppliers didn't do much to really comfort the retailer. So the problems were basically the supplier was not able to handle any promotions that the retailer put on, which caused a spike in the demand. They were not able to take that information and plan appropriately for it. So anyway, the relationship broke up because many aspects of what is necessary to make it function well was not in place. Distributor integration, this is a case where a retailer, there may be several distributors in a network, and rather than functioning independently, they need to function a bit more collaboratively so that they offer greater value to retailers. So the thing about it is that they have good information about what their customers want because they have customers that they satisfy, but they also have some information too about what's happening at the level of the manufacturers in terms of lead time and so forth. So they are middle people, and as a result, because they have information from both sides, the integration into the supply chain can be quite important. Okay, so the distributors typically rely on manufacturers to supply the necessary parts and expertise. At the same time, they rely on their customers to provide information about demands and so forth. Part of what they help to do in terms of trying to integrate the distributors is that they will help to address some inventory-related issues. One of the things have to do with risk pooling, because remember we talked about that if you have multiple distributors, rather than all of them carrying the same inventory, they could sort of redistribute the inventory amongst themselves and do some aggregation of that inventory. And that then allows them to keep lower levels of inventory for the individual items. So doing some inventory pooling help to reduce some costs across the network. All right. One thing is that if they share information, then they have knowledge of what's available at each of the various distribution centers, and that information is important because if one distributor receives an order and don't have the particular product, they might be able to have it shipped out of another distributor because they have access to that information. So it really helps to improve service levels and lower inventory costs. All right. The other thing too is that some distributors actually might decide to specialize in particular parts, specialize in particular products, so they could become quote unquote centers of excellence. All right, and so again, just looking at the distributors as a group and figuring out how best to integrate them into the supply chain is quite important. There are some issues, just like all the other strategies that we talked about earlier. Sometimes the distributors might say, well, what's in it for me? Why do I need to collaborate and be part of an integrated team when I may very well do better on my own? You know, sometimes the distributors might actually have to rely on each other a lot more than they want to. And these other distributors might be very well distributors that they have no formal relationship with, or they had never had any formal relationship with them. So you're being forced into a marriage that might serve the retailer in the end, but may not necessarily be something that you're interested in doing, that the distributor is interested in doing. All right. This sort of integration of the distributors tend to require that a number of responsibilities be adhered to, and so again, because the level of responsibilities increase because of the need for that coordination, they may not necessarily feel that they have the capabilities to deliver that, and so they might very well be nervous about losing skills that they had before, but now are being asked to take on additional responsibilities that may somehow shift their focus away from those particular skills. All right. So in summary, we talked about strategic alliances. We talked about third-party logistics arrangements. We talked about retailer-supplier relationships, and now distributor integration. And all of those three types of strategic alliances are seen as sort of growth patterns in how supply chain networks are actually structured these days, and how they function. Because ultimately, the goal is to really try to improve the efficiency, the level of service, and try to reduce costs in the supply chain. And depending on the nature of the structure of that supply chain, these various strategies may deliver great value to not just the retailer, but actually the distributors and the manufacturers and the wholesalers themselves.